everyone. That is an exceptionally difficult act to follow. That poem was really moving and beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Hi, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you to Pete. Thank you for the organizers for having me today. Today, I'm going to be chatting about a crisis, which we're all very familiar with, but don't necessarily often integrate into our work on loneliness, social isolation, the need for social connection. Complete transparency, I do not do any research on social connection in the way that we have been exploring it over the last couple of days here. I look at it through what it means for building climate resilience, so I'll come at it with a bit of that debutante lens. But I'm excited to explore here, once these slides get going, what this could mean for empowering our networks to come together to address both problems at once. So, as you're probably familiar from having lived through this unprecedented summer of climate disasters unfolding all over the world, this last July, Earth experienced its hottest day, week, and month on record in 120,000 years. And the UN Secretary General is coming out with statements all the time, including this most recent one, that the dog days of summer are not just barking, they are biting. Climate breakdown has begun. We are not facing a future forward potential threat. It's very much in our backyards here and now. So I'd just like to start with a show of hands and an invitation to be vulnerable and honest with each other. How many of you in the room have ever lost sleep or found it hard to concentrate or seen your relationships disrupted because of your own worry about the climate crisis, concern over what it might mean for you, your children, humanity in general in the future? Yes, me too, absolutely. So I come to this work from having experienced profound climate distress, which started a number of years ago for me working as a science communicator and spending 10 plus hours a day with climate and environmental biodiversity crisis data, and feeling pretty overwhelmed by the lack of adequate action to correct these unfolding crises. And it was really made super salient to me when my partner and I started talking very seriously about trying to get pregnant and confronting what it would mean to have a child, knowing what I knew about the climate crisis. That wasn't an easy decision for me to walk into. It presented a big dilemma, which started to, yes, trouble me as it interrupted my ability to concentrate and feel at ease, but also fascinated me as a science communicator. And I thought, geez, if me, privileged, white middle-class lady from Canada is feeling this way about climate concerns, what does it mean for the people on the front lines of disaster who are facing historical marginalization and are unjustly made more impacted by the climate crisis already? So those questions went into research for a book called Generation Dread, which really looks at the psychological damage that the climate crisis is already exacting upon diverse populations around the world, and weighs out from under that burden in terms of the social innovation, mental health innovation that we can throw at the problem to protect people and planet. And what I think is relevant for this conference here is I was happy to see what Maclean's found in their review, which is that if Generation Dread has one overarching theme, it's that community saves and that trust and mutual care are at its foundation. And I know from personal experience that paying too much attention to the climate crisis without adequate community care can really threaten one's mental health. So, in order to understand why this is, let's just do a brief overview of how the climate crisis impacts mental health. So, there are multiple pathways, including the direct and indirect stressors, the floods, the hurricanes, the wildfires, but also the interruptions that they cause to necessities like food, shelter, and work can lead to anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, loss of community cohesion or sense of identity, substance abuse, domestic abuse, suicidal thinking and behavior. Extreme heat, the most deadly of disasters, is associated with violence, aggression, self-harm. And we know that the psychological impacts of disaster outweigh the physical impacts 40-1. So that's an invisible harm that is very overpowering when we're talking about disaster resilience. Then there's physical health. The climate crisis is the biggest public health crisis facing humanity today. It makes us sick, full stop, in terms of affecting air pollution, nutrition, the spread of vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, and more. And as we tend to get physically sicker, our mental health suffers because there's a well-understood bidirectional relationship between physical and mental health. For instance, those with asthma, made worse by air pollution, are significantly at higher risk of anxiety and depression. And then there's awareness, and this will probably come not as a surprise to you in the room, that the nonstop barrage of bad news about the climate crisis is stoking mental and emotional distress in these days of device-connected doom scrolling, which is all too easy to do. We're not all equally vulnerable, though. Those hit hardest and first include children and young people, women, people on the front lines of disasters, which especially endangers those with mobility issues, those living with disabilities, outdoor workers, ranchers, smallholder farmers, people with pre-existing mental health challenges, indigenous peoples worldwide because of the close communion that is traditional to the landscape, which is changing, and frontline climate professionals, the people whose job it is to pay attention to this difficult unfolding crisis and bear a psychological toll from the kind of compassion fatigue and burnout that can bring. So it's not just that as climate events threaten life and livelihood, they impact our mental health. It's also that as individuals get traumatized by these events, as communities get overwhelmed, as our health systems get stressed, our ability to build a better world by changing the complex systems in which we're living, by bringing sustainable, nourishing policies forth gets hampered because how battered we feel as humans determines how well we can build a new world. So what we're dealing with is a vicious cycle that we really need to interrupt with co-benefiting win-win solutions. Some of you might have heard of climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. The American Psychological Association calls this the chronic fear of environmental doom. And clinicians and researchers have stood up to ardently argue that climate anxiety is not a pathology, it's not a disorder that should ever be in the DSM that we give people a diagnosis for, because rather to be distressed about the climate crisis is reasonable and appropriate. The question is, how do we support people if it becomes functionally impairing, and how do we disentangle it from co-occurring mental health challenges like anxiety and depression, which may be under the hood. And so, you know, when we see that fossil fuel infrastructure is still being expanded and global power holders are not doing what must be done to safeguard a future in which humanity can thrive, we end up in a situation like we're in now, where many millions of people around the world are voicing a sense of feeling chronically insecure because of how dire the crisis is becoming. And this is heavily worn on the shoulders of our young people today. So it gets complicated in the literature from what's emerging around climate anxiety. We see that it can be very galvanizing towards pro-environmental behavior and action taking. It can cause a person, because of that, if we flip it on its head and understand climate anxiety as climate compassion instead, that it really points towards what we care to see happen in the world and want to protect, well then it gets people to better align their actions with their values and take important necessary change-making shifts in their lives and in their communities. But it's also potentially damaging to people's mental health. It's been associated with sleep problems, with eating disorders, with suicidal thinking and behavior, and depression, panic attacks. And then for others still, it can lead to complete avoidance of the topic because a person can't really tolerate the anxiety or distress that comes with climate awareness. So then it's the kind of ostrich sticking one's head in the sand approach, which of course thwarts action, is therefore not constructive. So in one global survey that my colleagues and I did a couple of years ago of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds around the world, we were looking to understand the psychological impacts of the climate crisis on emerging adults across India, Nigeria, the Philippines, the US, UK, France, Finland, Brazil. And we were pretty alarmed to find that 45% of young people globally say that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis are interfering with daily life tasks like eating, sleeping, concentrating. 75% of youth globally say that the future is frightening to them. 56% endorse the statement that humanity is doomed, and 39% expressed hesitancy to have their own kids one day because of the climate crisis. And these thoughts and feelings were significantly associated with a sense of being failed by leaders and lied to by governments. So we obviously do not want our young people walking around feeling this futureless, and we need to do something to address it. The Climate Baby Dilemma is a documentary out on CBC, recently released, which is where I met Pete at a viewing for this, which really follows Gen Z climate activists who are coming together to create political campaigns to tell their leaders that they're refusing to reproduce until their governments take adequate action to address the climate crisis and provide a safe and healthy environment in which their hypothetical children could grow up. So again, we see the galvanizing power of harnessing this distress in that kind of a move. But still, that's a lot to be walking around with as a young person, and we want our institutions and as adults to be able to compassionately support so that this is not the case. There's so much that we can do to protect and promote our mental health in our warming world, which also opens up this wonderful umbrella of supporting the rise in loneliness and social isolation that we're here to talk about. So we can really take this vicious cycle that I gestured at earlier, and we can turn it into a virtuous cycle by prioritizing win-win, co-benefiting policies and solutions that address both problems at once: the climate and improve mental health. So for instance, by unrolling tree planting programs in urban heat islands that provide vegetation that absorbs carbon dioxide, helps to mitigate against further warming, provides shade and cooling to residents on hot days that otherwise live in basically concrete jungles where there's not enough vegetation to support that. Not only is the climate improving along those lines, but also people's mental health benefits by allowing the ecotherapeutic effects of nature bathing and being able to be in a public living room and make social connections, right? So this is almost a triple win-win solution that we need to be able to multi-solve for. And what's really great is that there's a lot of rich disaster psychiatry research to draw on and public health research that shows us that we can prevent a lot of mental health challenges in times of adversity and extreme weather events by investing in our social connections and increasing our social capital, which is the ability of residents in a community to come together and achieve shared goals, right? So by being able to lead and follow one another and have those trusting social relationships, isolation is reduced, and we see that on the far side of things like, for example, to take this one Australian study where a cyclone ripped through a region, tore the roofs off of many children's homes, they found that the children in the local school who had the most social connections, other people in their lives to depend on and go to in times of emotional distress, they had significantly lower PTSD scores than the most socially isolated and lonely children in the school. So we see this kind of buffering protective effect where there's lower PTSD scores coming up in lots of I'll show you in a second, decades of research. And so this sounds really easy to be able to reach out and be social and help each other increase social capital so that we can rebuild faster on the far side of adversity and be less harmed by it. But as we know, it's been in the United States named as an epidemic, which takes a toll on mental and physical health, but also I appreciate what the U.S. Surgeon General here is outlining in the report, that when we are less invested in one another, we become more susceptible to polarization, and that this polarization actually hinders our ability to face challenges together that we can't solve alone, including climate change, right? So we also, beyond physical and mental health, this is also about bridging together for social transformation and the necessary social glue that we need to be able to achieve those feats. So it goes back to the 90s. This paper from 1993 shows that perceptions of having strong non-human kin in your immediate circle really helped people after extreme flooding in Kentucky experience less depression and stress than those who had lower perceptions of non-kin relationships around them. Or if we go to Hurricane Katrina in 2005, a lot of research was done on social capital around this disaster, but we see that forms of mutual aid, forms of being able to pool resources, financing, housing, help people survive, and certain forms of bonding and linking social capital allowed people to revitalize their communities faster than areas in which that was low. If we go to the COVID-19 pandemic, more recently, we see that in Australia, an informal grassroots intervention to create a Neighbor Day helped those who had experienced and participated in the Neighbor Day be protected against increasing psychological distress as compared with residents who did not participate in the Neighbor Day down the line when lockdown measures were tightened for prolonged periods of time. And so we can really invest in our resilience to climate adversity as we need to both work to mitigate further harm and be filled up enough with our cups of resilience to take on those policy changes and community resilience acts, but also protect against anxiety, depression, PTSD if those disasters come through our neighborhoods by investing in our relationships with our neighbors, right? And of course, this increases our quality ties, which are the things that we're grateful for on our deathbed anyway. So it's a win-win kind of social practice. But of course, not all traumas can be prevented. Some will happen and need to be responded to. And here as well, we have different forms of social innovation beyond the biomedical model for helping people with these kinds of signatures of anxiety and depression, which can be so common after disaster. Here we're talking about task shifting. Some may have heard of this innovation from Global Mental Health, where lay people are trained by specialists to go out and help their neighbors by picking up psychological interventions that have been stripped of their jargon and simplified. And then, even though they have no former psychological training or expertise and they're not mental health specialists, they go out into the markets, into the schools, into their communities, and they help their neighbors by administering these simple interventions. And more than 100 clinical trials have been done to show that often this kind of task-shifting approach can help people recover from common mental disorders even faster than primary care. And a really inspiring example comes from Zimbabwe, the Friendship Bench, whereby grandmothers are administered as these health workers who sit on benches in the vicinity of clinics and help people through 6 structured sessions. And clinical trials show that people who sit with the grandmothers and go through these sessions have significantly lower depressive symptoms than those who do not and just access primary care. So this is quite exciting because think of the relationships and mutualistic aid that is created through that kind of relationship popping off in the community. Another inspiring project is the Confess Project, where Lorenzo Lewis has gone on a mission to turn Black men's barbershops into community mental health centers. And so he goes around the South and the Midwest and he talks about his own experiences with anxiety and depression and trauma, and he trains barbers in this task-shifting kind of way to also be mental health community workers so they know what to listen to when men are in their chair in a safeguarding way with psychological first aid and ways to resource and triage them to support if needed for different mental health challenges that prey upon their community. So what does this mean to spread and scale this in all kinds of settings? The Friendship Bench has been adapted, is being used in Malawi, is being used in New York City. We can really diversify the ways in which we come together in community and don't just think of this as a biomedical question. Now, the climate crisis, climate anxiety, climate grief, this has really come up as a conversation. You'll see many an op-ed on it today. You'll hear about many people on social media voicing this, particularly in the disaster-prone summers. And so a plethora of resources has emerged in the last handful of years as well to meet this need. They are community-minded, validating interventions that are usually peer-led or lay-led, including things like the Good Grief Network. They have a 10-step program, which is modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous, for helping people move through climate anxiety and grief in community and find ways of reinvesting the energy they've lost from being stressed out into constructive climate actions that support themselves, their communities, and the climate itself. It's already being unrolled and used in 16 countries. There are now professional mental health alliances for climate, including the Climate Psychology Alliances of North America and Europe, the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. There's climate cafes, which is a decentralized network around the world where people can have frank, validating conversations about how the climate crisis is showing up in their worries and fears. And so all of this is helping people strengthen psychological resilience in ways that are, again, breeding of social connection and community. One of the interventions that we're doing is focused on community health workers in New Orleans. We've also run it with partners in Lagos, Nigeria, and in London, UK, but because I'm closely connected to the New Orleans arm of it, I'll just speak there. We have community facilitators from a Black community in New Orleans, whereby people are still talking about the world in terms of pre-Hurricane Katrina and post-Hurricane Katrina, in terms of how this upended everything. And of course, they've experienced many, many climate disaster-linked hurricanes since. And these youth ambassadors and elder ambassadors from the community health workers sector have gone out and then recruited groups of youth and groups of elders within their communities to have climate conversations that are guided by a conversation guide that's made by the community facilitators with support from the research team and input on what's known about helping people cope with climate anxiety and distress. And then at some point in the intervention, over many months of these climate conversations, which are validating spaces to share concerns about direct experiences with the climate crisis, impacts on mental health, ideas about how to be supported, actions they want to take, the elders and youth come together to have intergenerational solidarity breeding climate conversations in their community, because a hypothesis that we wanted to understand was if this kind of intergenerational support can especially help young people who have told us, including in that 10,000 person survey, I mentioned that they typically feel betrayed or dismissed by older generations and power holders on this climate crisis, or misunderstood for their concerns. We see this in a lot of the climate qualitative data as well. And so this is now being expanded through a community organizing model, and there's a lot of hunger from the participants to spread and scale this, because they found that it had therapeutic effect, but also increased a sense of collective efficacy and social capital, which we want to see going forward. So, I mean, protective factors, there's so many we could highlight. Just very briefly, a recent study found that climate activism can actually help buffer against the most harmful impacts of climate anxiety, not because climate activism necessarily leads to the outcomes that activists want, but it helps people step out of isolation and into community with others who care and feel the same, which increases one's sense of well-being. And of course, structural change is the main intervention here, right? We can't all just come together in community and have good validating conversations, and then the concern will be nipped in the bud. No, we need structural change, of course, because we can not continue to fuel the fire that is bringing on unprecedented levels of human suffering through compounding crises going forth. And so I just want to leave with a call to action for all of us who are invested in human well-being, social well-being, mental health, and that is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know, we humans have solved major global threats time and time again using international treaties, from saving and repairing the hole in the ozone to landmines, and now momentum is building for a new global treaty to end the spread of new fossil fuel infrastructure across oil, coal, and gas reserves that need to stay in the ground. And this has been signed on by the World Health Organization, by the leaders of many small island nation states, by hundreds of health professionals and their organizations around the world, and it's being explored at the highest levels. So if you can endorse this with your organization, it's a big help to all of us as we go about increasing our social connection to deal with climate impacts, both solving them and adapting resiliently in the face of them. Thank you so much.
You probably don't know. Oh, no, it does work. I just want to say thank you, Britt. I got to know Britt this summer. I was at a documentary showing up north here in Ontario, and there's a documentary on the CBC called The Climate Baby Dilemma, which is about her book and about the challenges that people are facing with their climate anxiety. You didn't know we were going to do a Q&A, but because of this, I love how you kind of set us up. Like, I don't do research in this stuff, so I may not be able to connect all the, it's like, and then you knocked it out of the park. That was just amazing. Anybody have any questions for Britt? Because I think this is a really, Susan? Here, we got a mic coming to you just so that.
Thank you. I'm curious, in the research that you did, you showed all of the different countries that had different levels of anxiety. And so I wondered why Philippines in particular was so high. It looked like they were the highest, but also just wondering if you know why some of the countries had more and less anxiety or worry.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So we see from those results that typically the lower middle income countries and those who are more exposed in the global south to climate impacts already, unsurprisingly, do show higher functional interference from climate thoughts and feelings. There was 74% reporting that, either perception on functional interference in Nigeria, in India, in the Philippines. I think it was around 67% as compared to the global average of 45%. And so I think it really outlines this need for kind of mental health justice, which pays attention to these forms of intersection identities that make people more vulnerable in more vulnerable regions to these compounding impacts. But, climate anxiety has been called out as a white phenomenon, as something that only privileged people with enough bandwidth and space to reflect would then have the capacity to call out as the trigger of their existential terror, let's say. Whereas for many who have been historically oppressed and marginalized, the the fact that the world is a tragic and unsafe place is a tale that's as old as the hills, right? And so it's for some people perhaps the first time that floor is being taken up from under them. But when we look at the data, we see it's not that. BIPOC communities and people in the global south and those in the most directly impacted regions are not also voicing what we can interpret to be climate anxiety. It's that it comes as a compounding stressor on top of other threats to well-being, right? Which outlines where the resources are most deserving and needed. So,
Well, one more just before Bobby Breckenridge is going to do a little session for us at the end of lunch, so we're going to go into lunch. Anybody have one more question before we head into lunch?
But the thing was, I think,
Yeah. Giselle?
yeah, well,
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm just curious, like, as a science communicator, how do you kind of like shift folks who are maybe in the position where the climate crisis isn't necessarily in their face to kind of shift that to like being more motivated to take part in what they can do to help solve the climate crisis? Just because like being Filipino, like I've grown my entire life like normalizing typhoons, but when like I find when there's like a lot of like natural disasters that happen in like western parts of the world, the coverage is so loud, and like that's when people tend to pay attention more. So I'm curious about your role as a science communicator. How do you kind of get people to shift from this is not happening to me right now, so I don't necessarily carefully, to like caring and having empathy about people like across the world?
it's a really important and complex question because not everyone is attributing the extreme weather events that they're experiencing to climate change, right? And so if you're going through typhoons and hurricanes and wildfires and so on and so forth, and you see them as stressful events, but you're not tying it to the climate crisis, why is your climate anxiety or climate concern sensor going to rise? And so there is a bit, and this is difficult as well, as to who is voicing these concerns the most. Is there a component of environmental education that is needed to provide that filter so that people are attributing these experiences to it? We hypothesize that yes, because there is data to show that public opinion doesn't necessarily change in some regions on the climate crisis, even after these compounding disasters come more and more. So I think it's about media, it's about discourse, it's about education. But interestingly, even in let's take Canada, the United States, where they still are lost people who are super rattled or concerned about it. What I've noticed, especially for people who are very powerful, have a lot of capital sway and influence to be able to urge their organizations or investments or have you to move the needle, they are often really shaken when, let's say, their children come to them and they express their feelings of being, let's say, futurists, feeling really terrified or feeling belittled or dismissed. Like at my university, Stanford University, John Doerr, who's a millionaire, just created the biggest donation to create a new sustainability school at our university. And why he did that is because his teenage daughter sat him down at the table and said, "Your generation created this mess. I'm absolutely terrified. You better rally all your friends and do everything you can to clean it up." And he said it was the first and only time that he felt personally caught in a way where he could never get off of and culpable. And so that kind of intervention, and Greta Thunberg has also done that with her parents and changed the way, her mom's a famous Swedish opera singer who then stopped flying as a result of her distress. And these are just sort of anecdotal. I'm not saying this is backed up by research, but what I'm noticing in terms of how people actually do shift sometimes is when they're close personal relations, social connections that they care a lot about, are very confronting and honest.
Funny enough, Robert Putnam last week said the exact same thing. Young people need to get in the faces of those people who could make change. So here's the guy who's been studying it for 50 plus years, and he's saying exactly the same thing. Britt, thank you. Okay, we'll do it quickly if we can. Yeah, Helly?
Thank you so much. I'm just wondering if in your studies you come across any research on how this is stacking on top of students or young people's other stresses, like how climate stress is adding to all the other stresses that they're facing right now.
Right. We have done some work to look at the stresses coming from COVID and lockdowns as compared with climate. And the main conclusion being that these stresses don't come all out of the same bucket. You can't just bulldoze these differences. But there's so many other things that young people are worried about. And the youth mental health crisis that we see with levels of anxiety, depression, suicidal thinking, and behavior cannot obviously all be chalked up to the climate crisis. As we've been hearing, the systemic racism is overt and covert racism. You know, there's financial insecurity, there's work and school stresses, and so on and so forth. I haven't seen, maybe Kipper Card, who's a wonderful kind of mental health eating researcher right at the back. I know he's doing a lot in this field, he's doing so much of our field too. Maybe Kipper, you've seen research on that, about disentangling the different youth stresses?
Well, it's really hard to do that, well, actually, because they're so deeply reinforcing that, and anxiety in general is such a contributing factor to climate anxiety.
Yeah.
That's why, like, marginalized populations are actually, even though they're not permitted their voice in the discourse, like people make us feel certainly. You definitely see that pre-existing anxiety being one of the most contributing factors to climate anxiety. And so certainly, you know, all of this is a functional response to your environment. And isolating what exactly your brain is picking up on to exacerbate that anxiety, like even a person's narrative might not correctly identify that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we have seen in some of our studies in the UK and the US that while there's a really strong link between pre-existing anxiety, sensitivity, and climate anxiety, it's not a prerequisite that you can also have significant climate anxiety without generalized anxiety disorder. So it's an interesting thing. It's early days for how we measure and understand this, yeah.
So, Britt, thank you so much. We're so blessed to have you back in your home country.
Oh, it's so nice. Toronto's hometowns.
So thank you for making the time today. And as we break for lunch, I think what's really powerful this morning, Britt's conversation, the conversation about marginalized communities, all the conversations today is understanding that at the heart of society, at the heart of who we are as human beings, whether it's combating climate anxiety, whether it's about inclusion, belonging, you know, the foundation of happy and healthy human beings, homes, streets, communities, workplaces, comes back down to human connection. So why don't we go grab some lunch, let's get connected, and let's make sure that we are building a community that's about to go out there and build a national movement across this country and around the world, because we all start to understand the importance of human connection more down and go forward. So we'll go have lunch and we'll be back in a minute.
Late. Ooh.